Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those joining us from the West Coast. I'm Karen Cabolas with the National Emergency Management Association, and I'd like to welcome you to the NEMA webinar, Virtual Operations Support Teams, Their Role in Supporting Responders. It's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Cheryl Bledsoe. Cheryl is the Technology Manager for the Clackamas County 911. She is also the Executive Director of the Virtual Emergency Management Association, which aims to build partnerships between emerging technology companies, emergency services, and higher education. Cheryl first became familiar with social media as a local emergency manager in Clark County, Washington. She's been responsible for implementing local, regional, and state social media footprints, which have included policy development, website redesign, managing blogs, Facebook and Twitter communications. She speaks regularly at national conferences, consults with government agencies, and provides training to diverse audiences. Welcome, Cheryl. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Karen. It's truly my pleasure to be here this morning and talk about the role of virtual operation teams in emergency response. I've been involved in all of the different roles that a virtual operations support team can have, from a VOST team administrator, which is someone who manages a team, to both being a team leader and a team member for teams throughout the United States and actually even overseas over in New Zealand. So I currently work as a 911 technology manager, and I'm still interested in the VOST concept because of the role of next generation 911 and how we will be moving data into an emergency response community. So I'm still very much involved in the mentorship and training and development of virtual operations support teams. And so it's my pleasure to chat with you about all of this information today. So our course objectives as we roll through this webinar will be to talk about sort of the history of VOST development. How did virtual teams sort of come on the horizon, and kind of what got them started. Then we're going to talk about what a definition of a VOST team is, kind of what is an anticipated life cycle, what types of missions do they respond to, what types of activities can you expect as a all-hazard jurisdiction. And then we're going to step through several real-world case scenarios. So we're going to talk about kind of the role of VOST teams in wildfires. We're going to talk about some no-notice dynamic incidents like an active shooter situation, as well as its role in severe weather, particularly Hurricane Harvey this past year. And then finally, we're going to talk about how you can prepare to work with a VOST team, either from an organizational perspective or as a perspective, a virtual member of a virtual team. And so we look forward to kind of rolling through these topics with you today. So we're going to go over the history of virtual teams. So the very first element is kind of whose idea was a VOST team anyway. And I have to give credit to Jeff Phillips, who's an emergency manager out in Los Ranchos, New Mexico, because he was the first emergency manager who really sparked the conversation of how do we manage social media response back in 2010. And so back then, about 8 years ago, social media was emerging on the horizon as something that the community was participating in, but really no emergency managers had really talked about how to incorporate that into emergency response. I too was a local emergency manager working for the Clark Regional Emergency Services Agency at the time, and I was very interested in this conversation, as were several other emergency managers as well. And so Jeff, with the tweet you see on the screen, really sparked the conversation and the idea that we wanted to see whether or not a team of virtual members that are off-site in one location could lend support or advice or sort of monitoring perspectives to something going on somewhere else. So if you were at the National Emergency Management Association mid-year conference back in 2011, you were privy to an event called the SMEM Camp, the Social Media and Emergency Management Camp. And at that camp was the first time we tested a virtual operations support team. And I was fortunate enough to be the team leader for that team. And so I worked with several off-site volunteers. I was not physically present at NEMA as mid-year, but we were monitoring that conference. We were gathering questions from outside, and we were also even just monitoring the audio levels. Could people sort of outside listen to some of the streaming and the quality of the audio that was being shared out of that SMEM camp? And so it was the first time that a VOST team actually was identified, defined, and used for providing some social monitoring assistance. And the reason this became important is we knew that social media was coming on the scene. We knew that it was something we couldn't ignore as emergency managers, but we also knew that technology is kind of slow to adapt in an emergency response community. And so you'll have a number of different agencies who some adapt and adopt technology faster than others, and some wait to see whether or not kind of the emerging trends become a reality. And so we knew there would be a variety of different organizations wrestling with the notion of how do we listen to social media, how do we gather information that's important to us. And so, so that's kind of where these conversations started. So following the SMEM camp at the NEMA mid-year, we began kicking off what we called the VOST Leadership Coalition. And this was a group of emergency managers as well as VOST team members who got together on a monthly basis to talk through what the issues were and where teams were spawning up kind of all over the United States. There were several teams off the bat that began working with the National Incident Management Organization wildfire teams, the NEMA teams that went out on wildfire responses. And so a couple of those organizations, we gathered a VOST team and they began working on wildfires throughout the summer fire season. And so at that same time, we also saw a rise in digital volunteerism among groups like Crisis Mappers, Standby Task Force, Humanity Road, and Red Cross kicked off their FEMA digital reservists as well, or the digital reservists for the Red Cross, as well as FEMA also began looking into setting up digital reservists. And what we noticed about a lot of digital volunteerism is that a lot of groups that are active in the social media sites tend to connect individuals with information that also can be found online. So for example, if an emergency response organization was saying that they were setting up a shelter on Southeast Johnson Street and someone in that area said they were looking for shelter, those digital volunteer organizations would say, here's what we're finding online, and connect people directly to the resources they needed that were being publicized online. But a difference about a virtual operations support team is we really wanted to cement the connection between an emergency response organization and the ability to gather information online. And so as we'll talk about the definition of VOST teams here in a moment, that connection between an all-hazard jurisdiction and the connection between VOST team is vitally important to the definition of what we claim or what we say is a VOST team. Around the same time, early about 2012, 2013, the VOST concept was also studied by a number of researchers. Project EPIC, which is at the University of Colorado, kicked off a number of different social media research studies about the use of volunteers in emergency response. And Dr. St. Dennis, Leisha Palin, Amanda Hughes, and Kate Starbird were all pioneers and real instrumental in studying the impact of social media and emergency response. They looked at the issues of rumor correction. They looked also at issues of whether or not volunteers could provide data that was important to emergency managers, and kind of how those teams were used and utilized by emergency response organizations. And so there's a whole body of literature that's been created both at the University of Colorado and at the University of Washington that supports the notion that volunteerism and virtual operations support teams can be very critical in an emergency response. Go into kind of what the definition of VOST teams are. So the standard definition of a VOST team is that they are a group of trusted agents performing web-based missions for an all-hazard jurisdiction. And as I mentioned earlier, they are not just a group that spawns up on their own and just monitors based on goodwill, but really they're taking critical missions of what the all-hazard jurisdiction is looking for during an emergency response. And so it's important the digital team is led by a team leader, and then is comprised also of a number of team members, and they check in on a regular basis with a liaison that is inside the emergency response itself. And so we'll talk in a minute kind of how that connects in, but that connection point between the emergency response and the VOST team leader is critical to ensuring that information is given that is useful, that is verified, that is able to kind of be a two-way street of making sure that information that is found online is given into the emergency responders. And so a lot of times that information the emergency responders don't necessarily tell a VOST team whether or not what they have found online is critical or not. The all-hazard jurisdiction gets to make all of the decisions with regards to how they disseminate the social listening reports and the information that is gathered online. But a lot of times I can tell you as a VOST administrator myself for my emergency response organization, we found that information highly validating of what we were seeing through 911, what we were receiving about community reports, about damage assessment, as well as it gave us a heads up on sort of the rumors that were gathering in the community that we could get a jump start on from a public information perspective and begin to put counter information out into the public stream. We'll talk through kind of the VOST life cycle. So this kind of outlines, this slide goes through kind of what how a VOST team works from start to finish. An all-hazard jurisdiction identifies that they have a VOST team mission or a need for a VOST team. And sometimes that occurs well before the actual incident starts occurring for the all-hazard jurisdiction. We see when there are noticed events like weather storms coming through or a pre-planned event where you know that there might be some social media traffic going on, a VOST team can mobilize well in advance of that to begin evaluating what is happening online and what type of social monitoring needs to be occurring, and really how high-paced or slow-paced the information is and whether or not the public really seems to care about the incident itself. So the all-hazard jurisdiction next notifies the VOST team leader. It says, hey, we have a mission. We're interested in activating a team. They then go through negotiating the mission parameters. An emergency management organization identifies what their chain of command is, how the VOST team leader will connect in to someone inside their emergency operations center or inside the incident command post. They will establish check-in times. How often do they want to hear from the VOST team leader? Do they want to receive a couple of reports a day, the narrative reports that we call social listening reports, or do they want to be notified of certain things that fall into an escalation criteria? So for example, some of our teams have escalation criteria where if there's been a shooting and victim names have not yet been shared with the news media, but begin popping up online, that becomes sometimes an escalation criteria that the emergency response organization wants to know immediately when the victim name sort of pops up in an incident. The VOST team then activates once they have the mission solidified with the emergency response organization, and they begin collecting mission-based data. And a lot of times folks have questions about how they collect that data, and usually they're using a collaborative form like a workbook on Google Docs to say, here's what I found, just kind of surfing online. They are doing a number of different types of searches, from keyword searches to geolocated searches, which means they're searching social media in a particular geographic context, and sometimes they're looking at a couple of different geographic bubbles, maybe around the incident itself, maybe around the state itself, and maybe around the whole nation, just depending on what type of response information that they're looking for. The VOST team leader then delivers the social listening report to the all-hazard jurisdiction based on the check-in times. So if an all-hazard jurisdiction wants a report once a day, twice a day, 3 times a day, usually the emergency response organization lines that up when they are developing their situation reports. So if they're launching a SIT report at 7 a.m., they may want a VOST social listening report by about 5 a.m. to give them the ability to incorporate some of that information into their situation report that they're spawning out from the Emergency Operations Center. And then finally, the all-hazard jurisdiction determines how they're going to distribute the social listening report. They may keep it completely as an internal document to their organization, or they may distribute that to a much broader group of participants. And so there's a variety of things that an all-hazard jurisdiction can do with that report, and it's up to them to make the decision of what they do with their information. Once a mission is over and that VOST team contracts based on agreement with the all-hazard jurisdiction, then the VOST team leader will typically run an after-action report with that team to identify what worked well, what didn't, what can we learn for next time's mission, and also to keep focused on what the changes are in the social media environment as well. We always find that platforms that are being monitored change from time to time based on the engagement of the social media platform itself. Facebook, for example, is notorious about making changes to their platform, and so the ability to search it changes as well. And then teams often will do exercises between activations in order to stay current on platforms and also to engage with the emergency response organization and better understand how emergency response works generally. So that is pretty much the life cycle of a VOST team. So the next slide focuses on the types of VOST missions, places where people have used different types of teams, and we separate these into 3 different types of events. The first are the noticed events, and those would be events that have early warning notice, like a severe weather storm that might be coming in a couple of days down the road, or maybe advertisement of tornadoes that might be in the weather forecast. But usually these are events or pre-planned events that have some level of either national or local significance that teams might be activated for. Another noticed event is the slow-moving events of summertime wildfires. And while that was not the case this past summer, we had some very fast-moving wildfires. Oftentimes, their fires occur in the more rural areas where teams get deployed nationally, incident management teams. And if they are working with a VOST team, they'll deploy it when the national incident team begins flying to their destination. And the VOST team sits back and evaluates and creates kind of a lay of the land. We have found, even in the most rural of environments, that there is social media huddling and presence that occurs in different locations. In more urban communities, you may see more traffic on Twitter, but in more rural communities, you may see a more significant presence that occurs on Facebook or a local community newspaper website where people put a lot of comments on the different articles that are posted. And so the VOST team kind of identifies where is the community huddle point for this local community that's being affected by this wildfire. And so in noticed events, you have a little more time to organize and get things centrally coordinated with your all-hazard jurisdiction. Usually you get your mission deployment and you negotiate that, and you are begin working on that even while first responders are on their way to the emergency event itself. In a dynamic incident, we define those as no notice events. These can be earthquakes, they can also be tornadoes that don't have a lot of advance notice. They can also be active shooter or significant law enforcement type events. VOST teams have been used in all of these scenarios at a no notice event where a team leader is rapidly pulling a team together and finding damage assessment information as well as copycat threats and active shooter situations. And we'll talk through some of that when we go through the case studies here in a few minutes. And then finally, we see that VOST teams have applied themselves or have been applied in a number of different unique circumstances. So there are schools and businesses that put together their kind of all-hazard teams that respond particularly at their local school or at their local business, and they may be monitoring social media for a variety of different sort of reputation management issues, and they may have a VOST team or a team that acts like a VOST team that works with their organization to look about what their student body is talking about or what their business reputation is online. We also have had a VOST team that is connected to the court network. We have had a high-profile court that does a lot of celebrity type juries, and they have used a VOST team to identify leaks coming out of juries that have been that have had high-profile folks in them. So that's a very unique application of a VOST team. And then finally, we've had religious organizations that are looking for faith-related needs in a community and how best they can activate to support. And so there's a team out in Indiana that works to connect on the faith-based side of the house. So there's a variety of different ways. The key connection point for a VOST team is who they report to and what the mission is from the all-hazard jurisdiction or the entity that works with that VOST team. And so that kind of goes over the type of VOST missions. So the benefits of a VOST team are pretty vast. They allow you to have situation awareness of what's being reported by the media, what your local community chatter is, and they can work sort of outside the very noisy emergency operations center or your incident command post. For any of us that have worked in emergency response before, you know that those are hubs of very frenzied activities at times, and being able to monitor what's happening online or through online traffic can be very difficult. It can also be difficult just to look at some of the traffic that's happening online because there's so much online noise or clutter. I think they say out of 100% of information that's available on social media, 99% of it is pretty much junk and resharing of old information or clutter typed messages. So being able to find that 1 to 5% of actionable messaging can be very important for an all-hazard jurisdiction. The final value is that your VOST team members can be spread geographically across time zones. When I managed a team in Southwest Washington, I had team members on my team from New Zealand out to New York, which meant that I could have a VOST team working while folks in my local jurisdiction were catching some shut-eye and are able to get some sleep during the emergency response. So being able to scatter your volunteers geographically can also be important to your emergency response. So let's quickly go through kind of a look at some of the some case studies. The first one we're going to talk about is the use of VOST teams and wildfires. And I'm going to talk sort of more generally about the pairing of VOST teams with National Incident Management Teams, or the NEMO teams. And I've mentioned already that VOST teams typically deploy at the same time a NEMO team gets deployed in order to evaluate where that community is huddling and sharing information online. You often will find, just like in a rural community where there might be a restaurant with a posting board where people are, posting up various messages, the same thing happens online in a variety of online communities. And so being able to find where those huddle points are can be very important to sharing instrumental information during an emergency response. We also find in wildfire situations that there's a real smattering of regional and national response in wildfires, which means there's many different organizations that are involved, from local, state, federal, and national organizations that are all working in response to the wildfire. And so one thing that's unique in some of these wildfire deployments is that they have also set up regional platforms, like one basic website in the name of the fire, so that they can gather all the information and really be able to credit all of the agencies involved and not just be one particular organization taking the website presence lead. And so our VOST wildfire teams have been a little bit unique in terms of their VOST skill sets. Not only include monitoring social media, but typically also involve setting up platforms and managing those platforms in conjunction with the emergency responders. In a VOST mission, a wildfire mission that moves relatively slow in a rural community, they are relatively simple missions. Sometimes there's not a lot of traffic online. Sometimes there's flurried activity over short periods of time online. So a lot of times the VOST teams for NEMO teams will provide 1 or 2 social listening reports a day, and they will often work with teams that are maybe 1 to 3 people, because it depends how much social media traffic there is really related to that wildfire response. Now, I will say the wildfires that we saw this past summer were unique compared to wildfires of past years, because they were moving through urban environments very quickly and they were very large scale, which means there was much more information available online. And so the teams that were involved this past summer were not of a small team size, but much were larger in terms of the 10 to 15 size teams in order to manage that level of social media information. The next one I'm going to talk about is an active shooter situation, and this occurred, this was down in Roseburg, Oregon, at Umpqua Community College back on October 1st of 2015. This situation is a VOST team, Oregon State VOST team, was activated by their state emergency management office, and it was a rather extended mission of 17 days. And the reason is there's a number of different mission changes that occurred throughout. When we initially received activation of this emergency response, we were looking primarily for victim identification online, were the victim names being released prematurely, and were there any additional copycat threats where people were identifying that they were going to carry out the shooter's original mission. And there were a number of different copycat threats found in this situation, which led to a number of different high schools and middle school closures during this response. This was also in a very rural part of Oregon, which meant that there was a number of spontaneous and emergent donations that were coming into this local area. And so we also began looking for memorials and vigils and community activity events, as well as offers of spontaneous assistance that automatically sort of went en route from the Portland area and from California to come in and surround Oregon in this response. We were also looking at donation sites. As anyone does during an incident like this, there's always a number of folks that are trying to capitalize and earn money or make money off of the emergency response. And so we were also monitoring a number of different GoFundMe accounts and worked very directly to get some of those closed down that were from illegitimate sources. And finally, we were also looking at presidential visit protest activities. During this incident, President Obama came out to visit Roseburg, Oregon, and that spawned a number of traffic online on social media, a number of different threat-based information, as well as protest activities coming out from the Westboro Baptist Church, and a number of different rumors of protests that were going to occur in this local area. So we actually created a pretty lengthy social listening report for this incident. I believe at times it was 15 to 20 pages long with regard to all of the different types of missions that were active in this response. But it was shared with the Oregon Emergency Management Office, and then that listening report was shared out to hundreds of folks in that local community, including mental health responders, including first responders, including a number of state and federal organizations. So it ultimately ended up becoming a bit of the situation report for this incident as they moved through these 17 days. Now, this team was uniquely covered 17 days because it happened from the time of the shooting all the way to the final funeral. And so the team stayed active through the final 17th day in order to cover all of the different funerals that were occurring related to this active shooter. So it was a pretty lengthy mission, involved several hundred hours of volunteer response, but was considered to be very successful in terms of providing support to the local community. The last case study I want to talk about is the use of VOST teams in hurricanes. And I want to specifically talk about Hurricane Harvey, which occurred in August and September of 2017. This was the first time in which we've seen multiple VOST teams activated in support of the hurricane situation. There were 3 teams that I am aware of that were deployed during this mission. I was most uniquely affiliated with Oregon's mission that focused on donations management, and their social listening report really focused on the types of shelter, animal, and human resources, as well as other types of donations that were being gathered in light of this incident. There were other teams that were working on sort of the resource needs and the weather impacts and the damage assessment elements, but Oregon's team very focused specifically on donations. What was also unique about the hurricanes this past summer is we had 3 hurricanes that backed up sort of back to back that occurred around the same time frame, also at the same time as wildfire season. So there was in Oregon, we had the Columbia River Gorge wildfires occurring at the same time as these hurricanes. And this spawned a number of additional requests for VOST teams that ultimately could not fully be fulfilled because teams were activated sort of all over the United States for a variety of different missions. And so it really highlighted the need to get these teams defined and typed. And we're currently working on a project with FEMA and the NIC right now to make sure that these VOST teams are typed. And we just finished the initial development of those definitions, and I believe that will be going out for national engagement in the relatively near future. So please keep your eye open for that so that you can participate and give feedback on those emerging definitions. So kind of finally, I want to talk about how can you help in preparing with a VOST team. And there's a number of things. If you represent an all-hazard jurisdiction, we really want you to think first and foremost about what your missions could be with working with a VOST team. And what I mean by that is really taking a look at your hazard profile. How often does your organization activate for emergency response? How often would information from social media be useful to those types of activations? And how active is the traffic online? Are you already receiving inquiries or questions on social media instead of people calling in on the phone numbers that you provide them during an emergency response? Or do you find yourself already trying to filter out or filter in what is actionable information? And so sitting down and really thinking about what would I have a VOST team do is really step 1 in figuring out how to work with a VOST team. And when I mean mission, I don't just mean what would be helpful to find online, but really defining who your agency serves. Is it, if your organization only activates maybe once or twice a year, would it make sense to partner with a different organization to serve a larger group like a region or a state? We are finding there's a lot of interest in developing statewide VOST teams, and we highly recommend that because of the ability to deploy it in different ways across your state's hazard profile. And so it's important to evaluate kind of what types of things. You may also be thinking about whether or not you would just have them monitor social media, or whether or not you would also be asking them to amplify or disseminate information. Would they be supplementing your PIO office and turning your press releases into sort of social media traffic or messaging? Or would you want them to amplify, several official sources that you identify so that your team and your message can be shared more broadly in social media? And finally, are you involved in a lot of regional activities where you're setting up web-based platforms? And if you are doing that, is there a way to incorporate or use a VOST team to also help you establish and manage those platforms as well online? The second big consideration you want to have is whether or not your organization should develop a VOST team, or whether or not you should partner with an agency, sort of like a club or activity-based team like amateur radio does in many different jurisdictions. So if you develop your own VOST team, it's important to understand that you will be managing a team that comes with all of the administrative responsibilities of keeping those folks engaged. Are they strictly volunteer? Are they professionals within your organization that are also being cross-trained to sort of take this mission on during crisis or emergency events? Or should you partner with an existing organization already in your community that does something similar? I always encourage organizations to take a look at what type of web-based clubs are out in your area. There's a lot of groups like coding groups and hacking groups and groups that sort of already meet on a regular basis. And sometimes you can develop partnerships and relationships with organizations that already have a fair amount of technical experience and might be interested in helping in your emergency response. Another thing to look at is how this engagement works with your public information officers. In my organization, we cross-trained all of our emergency managers to be VOST team members and supplemented with additional volunteers as well. So it was kind of a combination of our professionals plus our plus volunteers. So when we'd activate, we knew we had folks that we could immediately take from their day jobs and be able to focus them on a VOST-related mission. And finally, we want you to define sort of what does trusted mean in advance of a disaster. We say it's the use of trusted folks during an emergency response, but it's also important to realize these folks their hours can be counted towards your disaster recovery declaration in the future, but you need to have some pretty clear onboarding processes in terms of what makes them legitimate and trusted in the eyes of your emergency response organization. So do they need to go through the same background checks that your emergency operations center does? Do you need to have a process in place where you're having them come in physically and meet you in person? Does your state have issues with regards to your liability insurance and the way that folks can or can't participate in an emergency response? So the same things that you deal with from a volunteer perspective for any type of your organizations also apply to your application and use of working with a virtual operations support team. And so we want you to really spend some time thinking about what that means, how you define that, and what would it take to really have a team like this be trusted in the context of your emergency response organization. And finally, we want to think about what the best training delivery is for your organization. Karen mentioned earlier that I'm the executive director of the Virtual Emergency Management Association, and we provide a number of different one-hour webinars that folks can learn what it takes to be a team member, how to use the tools. We try to focus on different skill building and skill set type stuff, but a lot of folks have also found success delivering training in person or doing webinar-based training themselves, and also providing training about what emergency response looks like, kind of what does it look like when your organization activates for an emergency response. So really identifying, what it is your VOST team members need to know about your community, as well as what you need to know about your VOST team members so that you can participate with them effectively. So with that, we want to make sure that we answer any and all questions that you guys have with regards to VOST teams. And I'm believing that Karen's going to have some questions for me from your conversation.
Thank you, Cheryl. Yes, there are quite a few questions that we have right now, and of course, everyone is encouraged to continue adding questions as we go through these. The first is from Matthew. You gave examples of VOST teams. How would a local emergency manager find out if one exists in their local area?
So that's a great question. Right now, there's only several different stateside models. So I can tell you that I know Oregon and Colorado have stateside model teams, and you can connect with their emergency management at the state level. For other VOST teams, I'm happy to follow up and provide a list of where we believe teams are or in development. There's about 32 states that have either local city or state or county or sort of local organization contacts. And so I'm happy to put that together and share that with Karen to give you all after this webinar.
Okay, the next question. How do you recommend a VOST leader filter the information so as not to overwhelm the PIO, section chief, or IC? It seems as though this could be a never-ending chase of information.
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. And so Typically what we do is we develop the social listening report, which is a really filtered down view of information that is sort of trending or happening online. So as VOST team members are gathering information, they're putting it pretty granularly into a Google workbook or a shared collaborative document so the team leader can kind of see across the board, what is happening during an emergency response. And sometimes that information is shared directly with the all-hazard jurisdiction, but often it's far too granular for an emergency manager to really sift through and evaluate. So when we develop a social listening report, we have an executive summary right on the top that's usually half a page or less that gives you kind of the bullet points of what the issues are. And then we try to prioritize the topics from life safety down to property based on the types of information that we're gathering. So usually, each report that I've seen it's pretty easy to get a one-page read of kind of what the issues are, and then the liaison inside the emergency response organization can follow up with the team leader to say, here is, we want some more focus on this area, we want to learn a little bit more about what this means, and so that ends up being kind of a good conversation between the team leader and the all-hazard jurisdiction. From the team leader's perspective, there's a lot to sift through, but the team leader really is focused on managing the team to objective. So they're, spending time looking at what the team members are finding and sort of gathering, kind of evaluating, is this a one-person comment, or is this the comments of many, or is it kind of a trending topic that we need to include in the report? So usually they get pretty granular on anything that is a life safety report, because we want to make sure that if someone is trapped in an elevator, that is, even if it's not 10 people trapped, we want to make sure that the all-hazard jurisdiction knows that right away, and then we look more for trending information down at the sort of property level. Good question, though.
And Jody asks if there are templates and what to search for and what platforms are available to use.
So you can search any social media platform for the most part. A lot of times we ask that our VOST team members train up on 4 basic platforms. That includes Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. And that is because those are the 4 prime social media aspects for pictures, video, short messaging, and community-based messaging. And but what we find is, depending on where the incident is happening and depending on where we find the community huddling, you may find that a jurisdiction is using something completely different. And so it's not uncommon for an emergency response to really be focused in a different platform altogether. So when we train VOST team members, we're looking for a sense of curiosity, a willingness to learn platforms on the fly and kind of see what folks are talking about. We've had incidences that have focused on a college campus response with regards to meningitis that was really focused on Yik Yak, although that platform is now gone. We've had younger school type situations that have involved platforms like Marco Polo, or platforms that are much more interesting to the 6th grade to 12th grade groups. And so depending on the demographics of the situation and where the incident is actually occurring, often dictates what platforms you'll find yourself in. So it can really be a mixed bag depending on the tech savviness of the area and where the community decides to start talking first.
Okay. Chris is asking, with regard to the catastrophic hurricanes that have just occurred, that 911 was overwhelmed and survivors needed help using social media to reach out.
Yep.
How did they best efficiently capture those non-traditional calls and help to inform the operational response?
So I have to tell you, I was not involved in the initial life safety requests of the hurricane, so I can't speak specifically for the hurricane response and how that was captured by the teams involved there, because I had more visual over the donation side. But I can tell you that typically in a no-notice event, usually the life safety issues are put at the top when people find specific life safety issues. They are usually part of the escalation criteria, meaning that the team leader is calling the emergency response organization to say, hey, we have found this person is trapped and says they're unable to call 911, and is this the right organization? And then the emergency response organization takes that information and does what they will with it to see whether or not they can respond. So I can't speak very specifically on the hurricanes specifically on the response side for that. But typically what we see is those are usually part of an immediate escalation criteria, and that is passed along to the all-hazard jurisdiction for management. So that should be a part of any escalation criteria where someone sees something life safety, that the team leader is notified right away.
Great. Now the next question is from Brenda. She would like to know who's vetting the team members.
So that would be dependent on whether or not the all-hazard jurisdiction is running a team by themselves. And so kind of my last point of ensuring what trusted means to you is if a team is administered by an emergency response organization, then it's that organization's responsibility to vet those team members. And so a lot of times what we see is those organizations put VOST team members through the same background check process that they do their regular emergency operations center volunteers. And so they usually marry up those processes, and so it's up to the all-hazard jurisdiction to make the decisions on if it's a VOST team member. There are times, because some folks work on different teams, that different team leaders may get called for a reference, or they ask for references of other VOST participation so that a member can be introduced to another team if they want to participate on more than one team.
Okay. Brenda has a follow-up question. How do you address liability issues, legal liability issues, since law enforcement or other officials may take action based on the information provided by the VOST team?
That's an excellent question, and I will tell you that each state actually often has different processes of how to manage liability, and so we usually refer emergency management organizations to ensure that their team members go through whatever their state requires from a liability perspective. But I will say law enforcement missions are something that an organization needs to evaluate whether or not they will engage in a law enforcement mission. And let me give you a couple of reasons why. Is that you will, on a law enforcement mission, a number of different states are exploring where that gray line is between monitoring open source public information, stuff that people are sharing in social media, and the action to open up investigations. And so what we have found at a number of locations across the United States is that law enforcement may train their own VOST team, but they also are law enforcement officers. So they understand the oaths and the requirements necessary in order to follow up and provide, conduct investigation-related information pursuant to a VOST team mission. And so a lot of times when I say the VOST teams doesn't necessarily need to be comprised of volunteers, but they need to be comprised of folks who understand the roles and the caveats that that opening up an investigation can have from social media data. So it is really important. We see that a number of different emergency response organizations, if they are serving an all-hazard purpose, typically refer VOST development over to their law enforcement agency for law enforcement missions, or directly to the FBI and ATF. So there are a number of different reasons why you might want to consider that. The other issue with law enforcement missions is there's a differences of opinion sometimes among VOST team members about how comfortable they are being on a law enforcement mission. Even though we are not hacking, we are not looking at any closed source information, and everything we're looking at is open source and publicly available, there is sometimes a feeling among VOST team members that, you know, it's a big brother mission if it's we're evaluating protest activity or working in the light of an active shooter situation. And so it is really important. A team leader has to assess right away, or the organization has to assess right away if a team member feels uncomfortable in a law enforcement mission. We always advise them to dismiss that team member for that mission. And so usually mission-based communication is kept separately from the general team-based communication. So it's only folks that are vetted into a particular mission that get to see the chatter about the fines and the different stuff that are evaluated in that mission. So you also have to evaluate if a mission takes you into the dark web, into the auspices of looking in places. You have to evaluate the safety for team members, and sometimes there's rationales where your team may need to be on site from official agency or organization level computers, and not risking their own personal computers or what they bring to a mission, depending on where they're searching online. So number of different considerations when it comes to law enforcement missions.
And Matthew is asking if there is any value in embedding the VOST in with the PIO, or should they be separate?
You know, it's a very good question, and something I would say is still kind of under evaluation at this point. What I will say is that it really depends on the culture of your public information organization. We find that you would think that they would blend very naturally, that PIOs and VOST members may or may not be very involved in working in social media and sharing that information. But we find that sometimes there are some uh, barriers or I'm not sure if they're sort of barriers between kind of how the public information process works and how they are incorporating and using social media and having a team that actually just focuses solely on social media. And so I would say it really depends if you're kind of working on with a PIO team that is very embedded in social media and working, I'd say absolutely train them up to be VOST team members. If you're working with a PIO network that is very uncomfortable with social media, it may value you to have a VOST team that is separate from your public information side of the house. So it really kind of depends on how old school versus new school the public information office is that you're working with.
And next is Terry with Homeland Security and Emergency Services. They're partnering with their state university to begin a VOST, and they would like to know if there's a way to get in-person training as they begin.
Absolutely, and I think my contact information will be available at the end of this. Feel free to connect with me offline, and depending on which state and area you're in, I can get you connected with resources that are local to you. There's also a number of folks, almost all of my board members on the virtual EMA are very active involved in VOST teams, and so we can certainly give you a lay of the land of what's out there for you.
And Greg would like to know if you or other VOST teams have noticed recent trends or changes due to trolls, bots, and the spreading of fake news when monitoring social media.
I almost laughed because that is yes, an absolute yes. I will say actually over the last 2 years, information validation is becoming harder and harder in the realm of fake news, not just because the news itself is fake, but because we are finding that all of the backup and the background information can also be non-legitimate. And so it is some of the spoofing and information schemes that are being proffered out there on social media are very elaborate, meaning that traditional means of validating gets more and more difficult to do. So actually, there's some conversation even amongst those of us who work with VOST teams about developing some curriculum very specifically to how to validate information, how to what are your key tips and tricks to looking for fake platforms and fake backup sources and all that good stuff. But it is certainly it's commonly identified as a struggle for teams in their after action reports over the last 2 years.
And Matthew is interested in what the future or next steps of VOST team development would be. Do you think FEMA and others will move from reservists to incorporating members of the ICS structure?
So I think we're super excited by the project we've been involved in just over the last couple of months to develop the resource type teams for VOST. And so we're very much looking forward to kind of what that national engagement is and the conversation surrounding the feedback that we get on the development of those, because the importance of standardizing those definitions is that teams will then hopefully be a little bit more deployable across state to state. We've been very fortunate to be involved in the cause exercises, the Canada and America exercises over the last couple of iterations to test the ability of VOST teams to respond both in the United States and in Canada and serve as expanded mutual aid for each other. And so, I think the concept is continuing. It's exciting because it was organically developed at the emergency management level, and now we're seeing sort of some national traction in the development and the utilization of those teams. In terms of the future, I think it's really important to understand the evolution of data in emergency response generally. Right now, with our 911 centers, we rely typically on voice transactions, and that will be shifting over to data-infused transactions, meaning that there will be pictures and video and streaming content that comes into our 911 centers. And so the future really will involve a lot of interesting conversations among police, fire, and emergency responders about who makes the decision calculus on data as opposed to voice-related transactions. And I'm often intrigued because in the voice world of 911, we often never question the validity of the source except for spoofing type situations. And with data, it becomes really vitally important so that we're not getting distracted in dangerous ways for the safety of all of us. So I think, the future, not just of VOST, but of data and emergency response as a whole is a very exciting place to be. And I think the work that has been done already with VOST teams and will continue to do will really define the type of people who will be responding both in 911 and police and fire and all emergency services as we begin to wrestle with what data means to our emergency response.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. That was our last question. Do you have any closing remarks?
No, I just want to say thanks for your time today. It's been my pleasure to share this information, and I'm happy to follow up with anyone who has additional questions or wants to get involved in our VOST Leadership Coalition that continues to meet monthly. So thanks for having me today.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, and thank you to the participants for joining us today for the NEMA webinar series. And again, Cheryl, thank you for sharing your experience and expertise. As a reminder, there'll be a short survey when we close, so please take a moment to share your thoughts. If you're interested in learning more about NEMA, please visit our website at www.nemaweb.org. Thank you all again, and please enjoy the rest of your day.